I got interested in specifically in the Mississippi River, and when I was a lawyer in Harold Levander's law firm, and he was elected governor of Minnesota and asked me to be his chief of staff. And this was right at a time when Republicans were at least as, if not more, interested in the environment than were Democrats, believe it or not. And the variety of issues we faced, including Voyageurs National Park, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, some of the more famous Minnesota sites of national significance became issues. And I got involved in Voyageurs because Levander, being a good conservative but sensitive to the needs of the future of Minnesota, was a little slow to make decisions about should we be for Voyageurs or not, and should it be a national park, should it be done locally, should it be done at the state level, that sort of thing. And with the help of a young man then by the name of Bill Holds, we wrote out a little plan on a napkin for a meeting with the governor and persuaded him to take this on. He went to Washington, D.C. in favor of it. I called Jim Oberstar and I said, now it's your turn, you know. And in Washington, you get over and persuade Mondale's staff that they ought to get involved, and off went Voyageurs National Park, and I was back doing something else.
Yeah, what you said caused me to want to digress a second with a question. I remember in the 1970s, the lead environmental state senator was Bob Dunn, a Republican from Princeton. So things seem to have changed.
Yeah, there was really little distinction other than urban-rural, I suppose, at the time, that in the 60s and into the 70s. And one of the reasons that we got interested in the Mississippi in particular and other rivers was the urbanization that was taking place in our community. And some of the distinctions then would be rural areas wanted to keep rivers the way they were, and urban areas were interested in multiple uses, a little bit more concerned about the quality, water quality and so forth. There was a state senator by the name of Bob Dunn in particular who was sort of in between the rurals and the urbans. He wasn't the only one among Republicans who helped to bridge the urban-rural split. And so many times this was the nature of policymaking in that particular period of time.
So when did your focus turn to problems and opportunities posed by the Mississippi River?
Well, the first time my interest in the Mississippi River took me to doing something about it, I guess, was right after I left Levander's office, and I was asked to chair what was then called Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission. It was something that the Citizens League had originally recommended be a sort of like an intergovernmental process for deciding the future of the river. They persuaded the legislature to appropriate some money to the then newly formed Metropolitan Council, and parks and open space and trails, both rivers and on-land trails, became part of the metro planning process, which I was chairman of a citizens committee. And I have a gift from one of the staff members 40 years ago, in which he showed me two maps. This map is the trails in 1974 that we designated should be the future trails. This map being where the trails actually are. And you can see the Mississippi is prominent in this one, and it's partially completed in this one. So that's how it all got started. And he thought, as he left and retired from the Metropolitan Council, I ought to be reminded that I played a small role in getting this thing going.
Who else cared about the Mississippi River back then?
I think the people that cared the most about the Mississippi River wanted it to be part of their futures, at that time were the people that were already using it, the people that were invested in it for a variety of reasons, from agriculture to construction to transportation to flood control and all that sort of thing, and a growing number of people who had the vision to see that as more people concentrated their futures in the urban area around Minneapolis, St. Paul in particular, that there was going to be a need for a multiple use of that river. It was going to have to accommodate the recreational and the environmental needs of people in a big and growing metropolitan area. We had a little model getting started out on the St. Croix on the Wild and Scenic Rivers law. We had just general interest around the state and in the community in these environmental aspects. And the metropolitan area became an important focus for all those interests to come together, because there were dams there was the river, there was an existing use, and it was accommodating all those different interests, plus all the local governments who had varying interests in it as well, that became our challenge.
I remember when I was a kid, I lived up in Coon Rapids. The river wasn't that far away. My parents just told me, stay out of that river, it's absolutely filthy. And of course, that was all part of a trend for decades and decades, whereas it got more and more polluted and obnoxious. We've turned away from it. The cities turned away from it. It just, when did people start again to care about the river and think about doing something to rescue it?
Yeah, one of the, I'd say one of the challenges that all of us faced each time we talked about the Mississippi River and its future and multiple use and all these kinds of practical, we thought, issues, was water quality. And that was a problem that challenged policymakers for a long time. In my little piece of life, 4 years as executive secretary to Harold Evander, we created, with the help of Gordon Rosenmeyer, the senator from Little Falls, and the state legislature, we created the Pollution Control Agency and deliberately made it a separate part of, not the health department, but a separate organization. And the Citizens Committee became part of that in the future. And there was that rich tradition. By the time I got to the United States Senate, of course, and particularly once I got on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, it was all kinds of opportunities in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and creating non-point source pollution with Jim Oberstar restrictions. And it was, if you lived on the outside, you'd say it's like a kid in a candy store if you're a real environmentalist. But as a practical matter, none of those are easy to do.
Yes. It's just interesting how some of those great, I'm a lifelong Democrat, but some of those great reforms like the creation of the Pollution Control Agency, fiscal disparities, metropolitan government happened when Republicans were in control of the legislature. It's just hard to fathom that today.
It is kind of hard to fathom the fact that there were Republicans involved in protecting the environment and cleaning the water. And some of those Republicans were farmers, that were in one way or another caught up in the, adding chemicals to their lands in order to produce more crops, to feed more people, and all these good things. It is hard to believe, but it was the uniqueness of Minnesota, and thank God we're the headwaters of the Mississippi. It's the uniqueness of Minnesota that it was Republicans and Democrats who had foresight. And I think we would have called ourselves progressives if the liberals hadn't purloined that issue. But as you live today, in where you got climate deniers and all the rest of that sort of thing, and all we got is a pope, working for us. I know it's hard to believe, but it's the reality of what Minnesota is. I mean, we haven't changed. Some of our politicians have changed, and our one political party has changed, but we haven't changed as Minnesotans.
I love that quote. Yeah, that's great. So, this is the only section of the Mississippi River that's part of a national park. Why did someone pick this particular section of the Mississippi River to create a national park?
One of the reasons that we ended up creating this 72-mile stretch of the metropolitan, if you will, Mississippi River as a national park, was that some of us, and I remember it myself, and I remember the day that I made the decision to hire Shirley Hunt, for example, to come on my staff, which was once I knew I was actually going to be a United States Senator, which I never expected to be. I said, I got to hire Shirley Hunt. And so I brought Shirley on board, and all of her activities that I knew about in its open space committee and the conservation foundation work and all the rest of that sort of thing became a part of our work. And so we invested, on my watch at least, we invested in planning the future of the upper Mississippi. And we got federal funds. We went through that whole process of getting appropriations to investigate the upper Mississippi River. My approach, being a little bit more conservative, I suppose, than Bruce Vento, for example, was that it ought to continue to be a cooperative effort among, national, state, and local government. And that somehow in Minnesota, all those three interests could be accommodated and their powers used appropriately to create a world-class urban river. And Bruce Vento at some point, became chairman of the subcommittee on national parks. And of course, that gave him an opportunity to create a national park. And Shirley told me about it. I remember he wanted to do it. So I said, okay, I'm not going to get it done, but if that's the way Bruce wants to go, I'm sure going to help. And Shirley knows more about it than anybody else anyway, so she would be an invaluable to both of us in order to get it done, and we got it done.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Dave, why don't you talk about, you came to Washington early '79. I was by then over at the Park Service, having rejected your offer to work for you, for the wrong reasons probably in retrospect. But I remember clearly in late '79, Bruce Vento and Dave Durenberger coming to see the director of the Park Service, Bill Whalen, and asked the Park Service to do a study of this section of the river to start the process, which ultimately led, 10 years later to the passage of NIMA. And I think it was the combination of Bruce and you, with Shirley's help for you and Tom Kelly's help for Bruce and others, that sort of started that. When we do the video, I'd like to be able to start with the first study in '78, and then it led, as you recall, to this commission. You remember when James Watt didn't want to fund the commission, so you and Harvey Nelson figured out a way to get us some money to do it. But if you could talk about that initial approach to the Park Service based on the Citizens League study on that would be helpful.
You might be interested in the fact that when I landed in Washington, D.C. and looked around to see what mountains I was going to scale and challenges I was going to take on, I also found a friend that I had actually wanted to hire, but he had worked for a Democrat, and so I don't know, maybe he wanted a bigger, better things. His name was Peter Gove, and he ended up working for the National Park Service. So Bruce and I and our staff trotted over to the National Park Service, met with the director of the Park Service and with Peter, and said, we want to do we want to do something with the upper Mississippi. And he said, well, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I said, how about a study? Or Bruce did. I don't know which one of us said it. But anyway, we need to invest in a study. But you have to recommend it so that we can then go and get the money appropriated for it. Anyway, long story short, we worked together. We got the money appropriated for this study that I referred to earlier. And when the study was finished and we could use it to the ends that we wanted to, and we had a new administration, and we had to go through some other appropriation tangles. It actually took us about 10 years until, as I referred to earlier, Bruce got to be chairman of the committee, that we could actually find both the commitment from the Park Service and the money to get it done. But one of the things that I learned from that experience was to bring Park Service directors to Minnesota. And every single Park Service director that served from 1978 when I was elected until early '95 when I left has been to Minnesota. And he's been here in the metro on the MINRA, he's been up at Voyageurs Park, he's been to a variety of places. And in fact, I remember one of them staying overnight in a logging camp. We got up early in the morning, went fishing on one of those little lakes in Minnesota, and early in the morning when the mist is rising from the lake and watching the loons go up, ooh, ooh, you know, and he was mind-boggled. So that's what I tried to do, catch him.
Great strategy.
So this may not make it into the final short version, but it needs to be part of the history. So Dave, we get the study done in 80. You and Bruce work together and you put a little provision in a bill that passes the last day of the session in 80, signed by Carter, that sets up this Metropolitan River Corridor Study Commission that had the charter look at all 3 rivers. And then James Watt, remember James Watt?
Oh, sure.
Secretary of the Interior. And the first day or week he announces they're not funding advisory councils anymore. So we had this authority to go out and do a comprehensive study of the rivers. And you remember at the time, we set up a commission, Ray Black chaired it, I was on it, and we couldn't...
Now I remember it, yeah.
We couldn't do anything for 2 years because it was an advisory committee and it couldn't be funded. So I would call you, call Shirley, how are we going to get it done? And by some process, I still don't know how it happened, you and Harvey Nelson, who was then running the Fish and Wildlife Service in office, found a way in Harvey's budget, probably something, I don't know how it was done, to give us enough money to do this study that then led to the report that led to Bruce and you putting in your bills. And I don't know whether that you remember, but we wouldn't have MINRA today if some process, and I remember I would send you a note, and then you would write me a note on the bottom and you'd tear it off and send it to me. You wouldn't even have it typed up. And I'm working with Harvey, we're gonna get this done, but whatever you could remember about.
Are you going to get interviewed for this?
I do too, but but you know, you're the US Senator at the time.
Well, I can't remember stuff like that.
Remember we had but you remember the James Watt era where.
Oh yeah, right.
You could just talk about that for a minute, then I'll add to it when they interview me. Because, you know, Ray's not around, Harvey's not around, all of that.
In the process of evolving this study of the upper Mississippi and the 3 rivers and so forth, one of the more interesting roadblocks was a guy who got appointed Secretary of the Interior by the name of Jim Watt. And I quickly came to know Jim Watt in a couple of arenas. One on the Advisory Commission for Intergovernmental Relations, which Reagan put him on as chair, I think to kill the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, which went to my heart, you know, like that. But the other one was appointing Ann Gorsuch as EPA administrator and things like that. But Watt was like, he was going to dismantle the federal government's role in a lot of things, including advisory committees like we had with Ray Black as chair, just by defunding them. You know, just go through all these places you can find money and, you know, X them all out. So it was hard, but it wasn't as hard as it might look in retrospect, because I was on to Jim right off the bat and kind of understood, with a little help from the outside, from, you know, people that would prod me periodically, like Peter Gope, whom I've already mentioned at various times. We eventually got the job done, usually at the last minute, in somebody's budget, like Harvey Nelson helped us, you know, get it into the Fish and Wildlife Services budget.
You know, things don't happen, they're made to happen. There must have been a dedicated core that pulled together to create this national park, and you've already mentioned a little bit about that. Could you expand on that?
Sure. One of the things that I learned both in Levander's office and then later by getting involved in the Citizens League, which was deeply concerned with the sort of the governance and making things happen in the community, was that citizens actually made things happen. So I always sought out and leaned on people that were willing to see the future and show me the future and let me know what I can do to be helpful to get there. And so there are a lot of these kinds of people. One on the river, of course, who we all treasured because of both his foresight and his sense of humor and his boat on the Mississippi River, was Tom Kelly. And so whether you looked forward or not to spending a lot of time on the river, Tom would make sure you did. And so I can still remember, and I wish he were here to talk to all of you about how incredibly valuable this resource was to all of us. And his duty was to make us see that, see what he saw, see what he experienced. We didn't have to have a boat, we could use his boat to do it. He didn't have a voice at my level, so I became a voice for people like that. And that's the great thing of Minnesota, and when a resource like the river, which can pull us all together, comes along, that's what makes us great.
The National Park Service oversees a vast array of properties that are called national parks. They range from Yellowstone to Glacier to battlefields to the White House, of all things. Now, if you look at Minrock, that's kind of an unconventional national park too. So, how did it occur to people to be that creative, to take a 72-mile section of a river and not really own any land but make it a national park?
It took creative people to think that you could make a national park out of a river as big as or a part of the river as big as the Mississippi River. And I think it tells you something about how special resources get protected. They get protected by people that can see their value to future generations. And that's what a lot of Minnesotans are. They can see the value of this. And in our case, I think it's because we so deliberately, in the 60s and the 70s in particular, we've so deliberately thought about the future of the metropolitan Twin Cities area. And we knew that in the heart of that, there wouldn't have been a Twin Cities here if there hadn't been a Mississippi River. In the heart of it is the Mississippi River. And how can that not be an incredibly valuable resource that needs to get preserved for everyone as this community evolves? And the national park, one of the reasons for a national park is you can't leave it to every community to create a metropolitan area, preserve that is available to everybody. So you need this larger context, and only in Minnesota, I think, would somebody have thought of that sort of thing.
We talked a little bit earlier about this, but the political climate at the time this was created seems to me to be a little different than the political climate today.
Well, the political climate is a part of how you reflect the creativity, the resource, the futures of ordinary people in a representative form of government, which is what we have uniquely. The difference between yesterday and today, in other words, the time that I served and the present time, largely represents an effort on the part of two parties, first the Democrats, then the Republicans, to become national parties. The Democratic Party probably started with Hubert Humphrey in the late 40s and into the 50s and so forth. They became a national party, and that was his goal. And you have Vice President Mondale and Gene McCarthy and other people as national figures. Minnesota didn't go that route on the Republican side. The strength in the Minnesota Republican representative government side was governors from Harold Stassen to all the way to Arnie Carlson, including Levander and Elmer Anderson and Luther Youngdahl and people like that, plus legislatures that were, a combination of conservatives and liberals and Republicans and Democrats. And that was the strength of bipartisanship, came from the fact that the Republicans stuck it out as a Minnesota party until sometime in the 90s, and now they've become a national party, and it's harder to bring people together at that level on issues that are important to Minnesotans.
You've kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but who would you say were the main champions in the Senate and the House for the creation of Minnesota?
Well, I've reflected on the fact that everything has a champion, and too often the congressman and the senator get to be the champion. But I think the real champions are the people First, the people that work for us. Secondly, the people that stimulate us. Thirdly, the people that pique our interest in something. Fourthly, the people that support us consistently as long as we're consistent in our support for them. And so it's almost nameless. I mean, the number of people that make something like a national park in an urban area like this a possibility. Obviously, it takes, because I'm sitting here doing this interview, it takes somebody like me to say that, I suppose, or Bruce Vento, were he able to do it. But the fact is, you can't pick out one person that makes the difference in anything as significant as the creation of taking an international resource like the Mississippi River and turning it into a 72-mile national park.
Since you and Bruce Vento were kind of the prime movers on this in the Congress, could you describe the working relationship the two of you had?
Bruce Vento and I had a relationship that was in part went back to when he was in the legislature and I was in the governor's office, and so we had similar interests, and we were both in politics in one way or another. He was a teacher by profession. I happened to be a lawyer, but my folks were both teachers, so I can relate to him on that kind of a level. He's St. Paul, I'm Lake Wobegon or Collegeville or whatever it is, but we're interested in the same things. He happens to come to it from one view of the role of government, I come to it from another role of government. You can either turn that into a conflict or a confrontation, or you can turn it into something that's constructive. And being Minnesotans in the era in which both of us served, we always turned it into something constructive. And we were able to do that with each other, with people from opposite parties, with the Senate and the House, and that's the way government used to work.
I assume that there were certainly advocates for the creation of this park, but perhaps there were some opponents as well. Could you comment on that?
I think there's some in every occurrence or every event like the creation of a national park, you can find people that without whom it may not have happened. That's certainly the case, and there's so many people that are involved in being for it that it's hard to pick out one or the other. But one of the distinctions is that it was people that were for the national park in Minnesota. In terms of the opponents, it was mainly industries. It was mainly people that would be affected in one way, they thought adversely, by another use, particularly one that was a popular use, I mean in volume of people using it and preserving it and changing its environmental character as well, restoring the quality of the water and so forth. So you could, all of a sudden, you've got some, quote, economic interests that convert into special interests, that convert into, economic or monetary power. And those, in the case of Minnesota, were a combination of the people that affected flood control and utilization of the waters. And it obviously included agriculture, it included transportation, it included construction, it included, a lot of uses, to say nothing of all the people that wanted to live as the urban area became more populous and spread out to all the suburbs. They want to live on the river, and they want the river to be whatever they want the river to be, not what their children, grandchildren, and those of a couple million other people might like it to be.
How about local units of government?
Local government has learned a lot through the process of watching the evolution of the national park in the metropolitan area. And in fact, I reflect fondly on the fact that when I introduced a bill to give counties some authority over land use through zoning on the upper Mississippi River, going all the way to its source, I had the support of every one of all the county commissioners in every one of the counties. And I think to a degree, they learned on the process that we went through in the late 70s and the early 80s with regard to the Mississippi River. And they could see that their places would, the places that they had jurisdiction over would change as well. So there's much more anybody can say about local government, and particularly when it's affected by politics. But there's a genuineness to it that gets reflected in county commissioners and members of the city council sometimes that can see the future as well as some of us who hold other offices.
Given the rich history that the Mississippi River played in the history of this country, commerce, everything, it strikes me it was kind of unusual. It took almost 200 years for someone to figure out how to create a national park on some segment of it. Any thoughts about that?
You know, I occasionally think about why did it take us a couple hundred years to come up with a national park on the Mississippi River, and I think the answer is that nobody really thought about it. You know, you think about a national park being out some remote area, preserving like like all of the people that thought that the lakes up on the border near International Falls could be a national park. It took a long time to get to that point and a long time to execute on it. But you know, you think about wilderness, you think about large tracts of land or bodies of water that need to be preserved. And so rivers are looked on as largely, traditionally, always been transportation. You know, how did James J. Hill get here to build railroads? He got here to go into the barge business on the Mississippi and up in the Red River and so forth. And that, I think that's probably the reason that we never thought about it.
Could you describe your battle plan and the experience you had passing this through the Senate?
The passage of a bill like this is largely an effort of a lot of meetings. I don't know how many meetings, but you know, the senator or the congressman is not at all of those meetings. And so one of the things that I recall about the passage of the legislation is you work off of, you know, what is the current climate and when is the time right? In this case, it took us, 8 to 10 years, I think, to get to that particular point. But one of the things that we do pretty well as members is we sense what's a good time to act. And usually it's budgetary, because you're talking about appropriations, not just the authorization itself. It's budgetary, and it certainly was in this case as well. So you had to wait for the right climate, and I think the late 80s, we seemed to be the right time to do it. We had seemed to have turned the deficit ship around, which was, you know, trying to sink everybody's boats, you know, in this regard. And so it was a matter of going to the right people. Pete Domenici, my friend on the Senate Budget Committee, and the former governor of Florida, who was the Democratic chair of the Budget Committee.
Let's say you had been elected in 2006 and we're about 10 years into your tenure in the U.S. Senate now. Would it be possible to pass a bill like this in today's Congress?
If you step back and think about, suppose we hadn't done what we had done. Suppose Bruce and I had not gotten out ahead of this and insisted that we didn't need it for ourselves, but it was something that those of us who believe in generational equity and in our grandchildren and their children and so forth, take the bull by the horns. I think in today's environment, it would be incredibly difficult to do this. We already know how difficult it is to preserve it, to expand it, to just follow that plan that I helped design 40 years ago to turn this 72 miles into a trail to be preserved, to say nothing of a park, national park to be preserved. I think in today's climate, political climate in particular, that would be pretty hard to do, which means you got to work harder at it. You just have to work harder at it. And every time an opportunity to expand the zoning or the ownership or occurs, you have to have an organization ready to take advantage of it, and people that are ready to take advantage of it. By the same token, when somebody says, no, we don't want our land involved, such as has happened with frequency, again, somebody's got to be there to stop that train, slow that train down, and derail it with a positive message about what's been the plan for that. How do you make that resource a reality, not how do you get in its way, because it's here for sure, and you have to have somebody who will make sure that it's protected and its future is guaranteed.
Looking back in time to the time when you were envisioning the creation of this national park, and now looking at it today, how close as this park has manifested itself, how close is it to your original vision?
When we first got going on this national park in the middle of an urban area, I don't think we could adequately do justice to what this park could be. We're not there yet by a long shot. We still got a long way to go. Are we attracting every visitor that comes to Minnesota that flies in and wants to see the Mall of America to go practically across the street to the Minnesota, the refuge right across the street, to say nothing of the Mississippi River? No, we aren't there yet. And I think one of the reasons we're not there yet is that it's a time in which people have a whole lot of different economic interests. They have that's a different set of challenges. But that only means you got to work harder at it, because the significance of this to future generations is so critically important. And the future of those of us who are proud to be Minnesotan is so critically important that our work is maybe half done. We still got a long way to go. But I can't tell you, we could imagine, our imagination could take us step by step into the creating of it. It couldn't see that future, but I guess you'd measure that future by the number of people that are attracted to this state and love to live in this state or to visit this state, because we have this unique resource.
What are some of your favorite, or what is your favorite spot in the park?
I've used the Mississippi River off and on for just a whole long period of time. But I'll bet you, like a whole lot of Minnesotans, one of my favorite places in the Mississippi River is any place where you can see this river. I bet my most frequent use of it is going to the Science Museum in Minnesota and helping little grandkids, learn how to get that towboat to go down this river. There are resources like the Science Museum and the History Center and a lot of places in Minnesota that'll give you what you need to educate kids to the value of the river and to grow them up as supporters of this river. And so it's that makes me believe that there will be all of the vision the fruition of all the vision that we have seen for the future of this park.
Can you imagine what the Mississippi River would be like if there hadn't, if it created this section of the Mississippi, what it would be like if the park hadn't been created and if there hadn't been an environmental movement to clean up the river? When I think about what would have been like if we hadn't done what we did, I think the Twin Cities and the metropolitan area would be different. I don't have any doubt about that. I think living here would be different. I think people take it for granted that it's here. I think people will be surprised. A lot of people are going to be surprised, when they hear people say, we had a 40-year vision, we had a map, that sort of thing for the river community, or the $1 billion stadia, or whatever it is.
It's that river. You know, that river that joins Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's like, why not live here?
Projecting into the future, what would you like to see? What would your vision be for MINRA going forward?
If I look into the future of my kids and my grandkids and their utilization of the river has to be, in my opinion, and this isn't ownership of an idea, it has to be what we could see, those of us who were part of the Metropolitan Open Space Commission 40 years ago. It has to be a vital part of the future of the environment we live in and the trail system that we recreate in, and to the degree that it's an economic necessity for this community, part of our economics as well. That will mean consistency in public policy as it relates to the water quality, the land utilization, zoning, ownership, a consistency in all of the local, state, and federal policies that relate to this 72-mile stretch. And it clearly takes an organization of some kind or something that people can rally around to make this happen. Right now, politicians aren't the place you go to in order to make it happen. It's the place you go to make things, not bad things, not happen. But there will be a time, there will be champions. There will be people just like we were 40 years ago and so forth. Because the support system's already there. And all of us who were there 40 years ago are still here today to make sure it works.
What do you see as the greatest threats to the Mississippi River going forward?
What is the what?
The greatest threat.
Oh, the
Pressure.
threat.
What are the pressures and threats that you worry about?
Thinking about the threats to the Mississippi River, currently the most important one, of course, is pollution. Because this river, you know, this river flows from here into a great lake called Lake Pepin, for example. You know, you want to lose a resource like that, to say nothing of the resource that flows through the city here. So the greatest threat comes from, particularly from the tributaries or the other rivers that flow into the Mississippi River, to be specific, the Minnesota River. And there's just no doubt about the sources of water pollution that come there. One of the reasons that Jim Oberstar and I worked so hard on creating non-point source pollution rules in the Clean Water Act was just that. Did I take heat from farmers? Sure. Yeah, of course I did. No question about it. Was the chemical companies involved in, you know, heating it up and so forth? Yeah, I'm sure we both did. But the Congress saw value in non-point source pollution legislation. They saw the value in having some way to bring farmers together with everybody, with all the people that ate the food that comes off of the farm. And I think we still are going to get back to that period of time. And it's here now. We're conflicted right now. It's pretty clear. Everybody knows it. It's a matter of finding a way in which to do it and in which to allow some of those people in agriculture to take the lead in helping us preserve the water as well as the land.
Now, I've exhausted my questions. Peter, Whitney, Tom?
I have one. You sort of started to allude to this a little bit, Dave, but looking for...
My voice is going, so I'm going to have to do something.
There's a little bit of coffee left.
That was mine.
Yeah. The National Park Service does not have many regulatory authorities that extend to the river. Most of the regulatory authority, land use authorities, of course, local governments along the river, and then we have, state. But can you talk a little bit about the decision to utilize the Mississippi River critical area which was initially, as you recall, an executive order, a Wendell Anderson executive order made permanent by Al Quie. To utilize that critical area framework.
Is this the one we write letters for you on?
Yes.
Right, thank you very much.
One of the threats that was foreseen to the river was the inconsistency in terms of regulation, of land use regulation, and whether it's agriculture or it's zoning in the metropolitan area, whatever the case may be. And when Lemander left office and Wendy Anderson took over from him, one of the unique things that he put into effect was critical areas executive order. And as a regulatory foundation, or a foundation on which to premise uniform regulations for the Mississippi River. And that was reinforced later when Al Quie, a Republican, became governor of Minnesota. I think consistent with my principles as a more conservative role of government, and consistent with Bruce Vento's as a more liberal approach to the role of government. What Wendy did, what Al Quie did, the critical areas kind of regulation, if you will, is the way to go in the future, because that brings consistency for everybody. You know, nobody's left out of this one, and nobody's disadvantaged by this, you know, in a long-term sense. And so it's really, really important to fight for a continuation of the critical areas approach.
All right,
Did that get Anna?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
all right.